It's great to have you with us, Sandy. I don't have I've already done a lot of talking to this group today, but I just say one thing. Barbara Metzger, who was our manuscript editor for 30 years, and Fran, the first 20 years, we're celebrating 50 years officially next month. But our issue on LAP for March is not going to come out until April, because we're a little bit behind schedule because Barbara passed away in December, and she was the world's fantastic copy editor. I mean, she could really edit in ways she wouldn't let any nonsense get through anything, and so on. But Barbara had almost a full collection of Latin American perspectives, about 40 years of the 50. And that has been given to Cal State Los Angeles and the Center for Latin American Studies. And Bill, it's in my garage now. Her daughter left it in my garage, and Bill Bollinger is going to take it to Los Angeles the next time he comes up from San Diego. Well, I've been to Cuba, and Fran's been to Cuba once with me. I've been there 4 or 5 times, and not recently. But the last time I was there for 5 weeks. And so I know a lot about Cuba. It's very close to me, and I've always followed it. And as I've written a little bit of memoir, not much, I always talk about Cuba and the Cuban Revolution as having been what inspired me to do what I'm doing today. And we never want to forget that. And those of us who were at Stanford, and Sandy was at Stanford along with, and Tim Harding's not with us today, and I'm sorry, because he's usually here, but Marjorie and Don, and there were actually about 14 people associated with Latin American studies at that time, and almost all of them became involved with this journal. And when we think of its origins, we always go back to our roots in Stanford. We also, and this may baffle you a bit, we actually established a LAP lectureship at Stanford. They bring in LAP editors and people close to LAP for a week to
scare them.
Talk about Latin America and Cuba. We need to get somebody to talk about Cuba like you. They should bring you back. Anyway, we have been, Sandy and I have been talking a lot about Cuban painting and culture, and everybody is aware of that, but they don't know much of the detail. And we have in mind putting a book out, and thank you for sending me some recent books, including the one by Luisa Maria, is that her name?
Oh, good, you got it. Thanks.
They just arrived.
Okay.
And appreciate that very much. So we had this idea of a issue of LAP on Cuban culture. And you know all about that because you tried to help us out, and you offered an assessment of some of these crazy articles from some Cubans who are up in Canada, whom we invited to submit the material, but they decided not to submit it. I think they were really getting kind of concerned about us.
I can't imagine why.
I don't know. Most Cubans in Canada, I assume, are, doing a good job promoting Cuba. Anyway, it's a pleasure to have you with us and to talk and to get us interested and motivated. And I'll let you carry on.
Okay.
Go ahead, Sandy.
Okay, I have absolutely no idea what you really want me to talk about, but I hope that you'll have questions that maybe I can answer. I mean, Cuba's very complicated right now, as I'm sure you all know. And one of the problems in talking about Cuban culture is that if we were talking about the cultural landscape, say 5 years ago, it would be very different from what we're talking about right now. I mean, Cuba is in such a difficult situation that we're facing a situation where many artists are leaving, and which is actually creating a real crisis in the cultural arena. And the best known artists remain in Cuba, because they have a career in Cuba, and they also travel a lot. They go back and forth a lot. Many young artists, on the other hand, are leaving to come here or Spain or Mexico or Italy, wherever they might get a beca. And they're leaving because of the economic crisis. They're not leaving because of repression. I mean, there may be 5 or 6 activists who have sat in, gotten arrested, demonstrated, gotten arrested, and they have certainly said they're leaving because of repression. But I have yet to see any real repression of the artists. Maybe that's because I don't know that many artists under the age of 20. But I'm talking about people who are still working every day or every week as much as they can, whether they're working in music and theater, in the visual arts, in dance. Cuba has somehow, I really don't know how, in this very difficult economic situation, but somehow Cuban cultural life has managed to stay alive. You know, you can go into any Cuban city today, whether it doesn't have to be just Havana. You can go into Trinidad, to Cienfuegos, to Camagüey, certainly to Santiago, and even many small towns in between. And there are good local dance groups, good local orchestras, good local individual musicians. There are clubs. One of my favorite clubs is actually a Beatles club in Cienfuegos, where these terrific Cuban musicians sing nothing but Beatles songs and do a very good job, and to great applause. But the people who are in this country who didn't leave for any kind of economic reason, but many of them, for example, Ana Mendieta left as a child because her parents took her out of Cuba at the beginning of the revolution. Elsa Mora, another great contemporary artist, left because she fell in love with a hotshot Hollywood producer. And she, and she left with William. So there are, many people leave because they've married someone who is Spanish or American or Italian or whatever. But the artists who have left and have made it are distinguished very often by their ties to Cuba and by the socio-political culture. I mean, I think the revolution has really defined the best artists. And so even those who no longer like the revolution, have problems, had problems, it's always been interesting to me that the ones who actually have had the most conflict with the Cuban government have never really left Cuba. I mean, they leave, they come back, they get arrested, they leave again, they come back, they try to get arrested. They make a stink, like Tanya Bruguera. And I only recently found out that someone told me, well, you have to realize that Tanya Bruguera, who is in many ways an excellent artist and very popular, but someone said, but don't forget, Tanya Bruguera's father was a general and very close to Fidel, and she never really had to worry that she was going to be stuck in jail for more than a few days, no matter what she did. I said, okay, so that's very interesting. I mean, the kind of connections that people who grew up in the revolution have is very often, well, in a way, to me, it's interesting that so many of the artists in Cuba who do leave to go to the one country that has most oppress them, namely this country. I think it's a kind of Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah.
I really do. But many of the most famous artists in every field, you know, um, are navigating their lives now between Cuba and whatever other country invites them, can support them. For example, one of the hottest young artists, Mabel Poblet, is right now doing her second residency at the Dale Jurassic compound in the Bay Area for a month. It's the second time she's been here. She's also traveled to Portugal, traveled to Japan, been in Florida, wherever people know the artists and have galleries, have shows, have ways to bring them here for a time. But most of these people all go back to Cuba. And I think that a lot of it has to do with the fact that Cuba has a very strong cultural pull on artists of every kind. I mean, they were shaped by the revolution, they react to the revolution, and whether it's positive or negative, their art is formed by their years living in the revolution. And it's interesting to me that none of the artists leave before they've completed their free education in the graduate institutes of art. So I think they recognize how great is the teaching. And many of them have had, you know, incredible experiences. I remember the very first artists that we invited to the United States were Chilcote and Nelson Dominguez. And both of them, when they graduated the art school, instead of having to sign up for military service, they were sent to Angola for 2 years to teach in the art school there. And their 2 years in Angola shaped their art tremendously. They came back. I mean, Chaco, of course, is Black, and Nelson is white, but they both came back doing Black art because what they found in Angola was that, first of all, their Afro-Cuban roots connected with the Angolan students, but also the Angolan students and their culture connected with them. And I don't know if you remember, I remember a very interesting article in the New York Times and a fascinating quote from the great Henry Kissinger, who said that when he visited Angola, the only foreigners who connected with the Angolans and the only foreigners who went outside of the cities and went into the countryside and learned to speak their languages were the Cubans. Cuban doctors, Cuban soldiers, whatever Cubans were there, connected. And I think, you know, that's a part of the Cubans' cultural heritage too. The people who have, that most of you probably have heard of, are still very much connected to Cuba, whether it's someone like Alberto Lescay in Santiago, the great sculpture artist and painter. People like Mendive, who is, I mean, Mendive has been doing his art and his connections to Santeria and the Afro-Cuban history. He has probably done more to teach people interested in art around the world about the fact, as Fidel often said, we are Afro-Latino. We are not just Latinos. People like Jose Fuster, who started community projects. It's always been very interesting to me that in Cuba, one of the things that the revolution has done for so many of the artists is to teach them the art of community and how much more they can accomplish by working together. I mean, Fuster was from the countryside. He went to an art teacher's school. He started doing ceramics. And now he lives in a town outside of Havana called Jimenitas that is now called Fusterlandia by tourists, because the whole town has become Fuster's ceramics, paintings. The very first house he ever decorated was the Medico de la Familia. And since the Medico de la Familia permitted Fuster to paint the side of his house, everyone thought, oh, well, I don't mind if he paints my roof. When anybody who needed a roof repair got a roof repair, if they also allowed Fuster to put up one of his ceramic roosters, let's say. So the whole town is now personalized by the people who live in their houses and by Fuster ceramics. Other artists from all over the country and the world really have come to contribute tiles, and all of it is very political. You know, he's got a whole corner that is the grandma with Fidel and Raul and various other heroes riding in the grandma. So he's done a lot to teach young people about the history of the revolution while at the same time teaching them art. But he's not alone. You know, there's a collective of self-taught artists in the little town of Maya, about an hour outside of Santiago, that we met on our first art trip in 1995. And that was when they were just organizing. And Cuba has had kind of a prejudice against folk art, because with the revolution, the government has been so proud of their art schools, which were formed after the revolution, and of their professional trained artists, that they really didn't want to promote the self-taught artists. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s, and many of their academic artists chose that moment to leave, or they got married and left, that was when people who had never done any painting before suddenly said, well, maybe I can take up painting and get some money. And for example, in Cienfuegos, there was a geography teacher named Montebravo who had been drawing and painting since he was a kid. And he decided to basically start painting. And all of a sudden, he became famous in Cienfuegos. And when our art groups visited Cienfuegos, he became famous for us. And he became a source of learning. Even though he was white, he was interested in Afro-Cuban culture. And because he was gay, he was also interested in presenting the gay life in a very subtle way, but very definite in many of his drawings, prints, and paintings. And little by little, we start, and Ron knows this, because most of what he acquired for his gift to the university was self-taught art. And the self-taught art, we like it very much because it is grounded in where people live. What people paint is what they see every day when they go to work, when they walk out in their streets, when they are in their fields, whatever else they are doing. This particular collective outside of Santiago, for example, one of my favorite artists there is a policeman. And he very often would come home still in his policeman's uniform, sit down outside of his home in front, put up his easel, and start painting the kinds of things that you would never imagine a local policeman would think to paint. One of my favorites from another of those artists, one that I got very early on, he was a truck driver, and beautiful, beautiful, detailed painting. And I bought one of a young woman walking a path with a lot of trees and agriculture around. She's walking a path, reading a book with a little dog coming along behind her. And the painting is called Mi Mejor Amigo. And so I asked Roberto, I said, so who's your best friend? And he said, the book, of course. Most people, when I asked them, they said the dog. Said, well, but I think that, I tried to convince the people in Havana to start looking at self-taught art as valuable and something that they would include in annual shows or competitions. And they said, well, we're really more interested in academic art. I said, they're doing some great things. And so finally, one year, about 10 years ago, I convinced them to go to Maya. And they allowed one person from Maya, Luis El Estudiante, he calls himself the student because he considers his father, who ran a bakery and started the group, the master, El Maestro. So he's El Estudiante, even though he's now in his 40s. But then he was younger. And he won second prize in the competition. So ever since, the academic people who run the annual competitions have included some folk art. So I feel it was something we accomplished. The other thing that we accomplished at the center was that we sued the Treasury Department in 1992 to allow the importation of original Cuban art. You probably already know this, but in case you don't, in the late 1980s, thanks to Howard Berman, Congress passed a law saying that all informational materials coming in to the country would be permitted. But when the Treasury Department finally got around about 2 years later to defining what they meant by informational materials from Cuba, it included the obvious, of course, newspapers, books, everything we'd already been bringing in, not thinking it was illegal. Posters, photographs, prints, recordings, not original art. So I went to our lawyers, who were also the lawyers for the Cuban government, and said, I think we should sue them, sue the Treasury Department. How can you possibly say that original art isn't information, but copies of the original art are? Well, they consider information something that can be distributed widely. I said, any piece of art can be distributed widely now. Guess what? We have the internet. He said, you don't have a chance. They don't want Fidel to get the money. I said, what about the artist? He said, okay, I'll take it to court if you prepare the case. So I did. And we didn't really have computers yet. I had to take slides of all the art, pictures of with my knicker mat, pictures of all the prints of the art to show the difference, to show that the real information about a piece of art came from the original. Had 2 great big books. I interviewed 12 people who were critics and collectors of Cuban art about the differences, etc. And we went into court that day. And I saw the judge had my 2 big books, and he's looking at it very carefully. I felt very proud. And then he looked over at the Treasury Department lawyer and he said, do you really intend to carry this case forward? And the Treasury Department lawyer said, of course, Your Honor, why wouldn't I? And the judge said, well, because I can tell you right now, if the case is before me, you don't have a chance. And I saw Michael Krinsky go, and I went, and the Treasury Department lawyer surrendered on the spot. And not only did we get the importation of original art, but the Treasury Department decided to issue licenses to collectors and gallerists for the purpose of going to Cuba only to buy Cuban art. And while we were asking was the right to import it, to exhibit it, we didn't even suggest that we might want to sell it and never send it back to Cuba. But the Treasury Department gave us full reign. We could bring it in for whatever reason. We could keep it forever. We didn't have to send it back. And that was that. And so most of the Cuban artists are very grateful to us. And I learned something very interesting. Even though fewer Americans travel there than Europeans, for example, I was in Cienfuegos one day talking to a couple of the artists. And I said, well, but you must be doing great. There are so many Italians here and so many Germans and so many blah, blah, blah. And they said, no, they don't buy like the Americans. I said, what do you mean? He said, you Americans are the only ones who think you have to have paintings on your bedroom walls and on your dining room walls and even in your bathrooms. In Europe, people seem to think it's perfectly okay to go see paintings in museums and galleries, and they don't necessarily think they have to buy everything they like. So it was a very important lesson for me. I never knew that. I didn't think of that as something, but of course we are capitalists and we want what we want. So I know that we've had a big impact on many Cuban artists being able to survive, and they're very grateful to us for that reason. A lot of the people who have left, whether it's permanently or impermanently, of course, are in Florida. And Tomas Sanchez is in Costa Rica because he likes to do paintings of the environment. And most of the people who have left, and this is true of everybody, whether they're writers or painters or actors, have left for greater opportunities. I mean, that's especially true of a lot of the musicians. You know, you become famous in Cuba and you become famous in the United States to the extent that the US government permits you to travel here to get a visa. But you can't book into a lot of clubs depending on whether or not you're going to get a visa. And right now, Cuba is going through a terrible time. I mean, there's terrible food insecurity. There's a lack of materials. And there are greater professional opportunities outside of Cuba. While there were a lot of tourists, there were constant shows, there were constant everything, you know, but the pandemic really put many of these kinds of things out of business. And when you're out of business for 2 or 3 years, it might as well be a lifetime for some of these artists. And the greater professional opportunities and the fact that a lot of people, especially in the United States, have just been waiting to pounce on these artists who were not able to come and were not willing to leave. But almost no one who leaves thinking they've finished with Cuba, you know. They don't cut their ties to Cuba completely. And as I said before, I think Cuba has a very powerful cultural pull. And the revolution itself has played such an important part on not only the generation of the revolution, but the generation of all the artists who studied in all the wonderful schools that were set up, the music and dance schools. And there's an incredible dance school in Santiago. There are art schools everywhere. And they're competitive for entering. But they have an influence far beyond the relatively few students who actually go, because the Cuban artists are really not competitive with one another. They live in a very collective way. They share the people who come to visit. They share their opportunities. They share their materials. And I think that I mean, I'm not sure how far afield you want me to go in talking about Cuban culture. I hope just ask me some questions. The thing is, I've been there too often. I stopped counting after 400 trips. I feel very, very close to Cuba. I feel very frustrated that the center has not been able to end the blockade. I took the job for 1 year because the person we hired quit 2 weeks before we opened. Some of you may know or remember Roberta Salper. She was teaching Latin American literature, and she'd been to Cuba, and she was the person we hired to be the executive director when we first started the center. And 2 weeks before 2 weeks before we were to open, Roberta quit to go work with Claridad. And she said, "I'm going to be a Puerto Rican socialist now." I said, "You're a Jewish intellectual. How are you managing that?" So she was at Claridad for about a year, and then she went back to the university. But there we were, stuck. So that's how I became executive director. And I meant to stay for only a year. But a Cuban exile blew up the center with a very big plastic bomb with me in it 10 months after we opened. And it angered me enough to decide to stay until the embargo was ended. So I'm still here. Have you got any questions?
Sandy, thank you so much. The journal at one point had a problem with the U.S. government. There was a rule that didn't permit American journals to publish Cuban material written by Cubans in Cuba.
What?
Yes. And we had
You mean when we published History Will Absolve Me, we were illegal?
We had an article by a Cuban anthropologist, I think, focused on religion in Cuba, and we accepted that. And Barbara Metzger, who was our copy editor or manuscript editor I mentioned earlier, she refused to edit this manuscript because the penalty was $500,000 fine.
What?
Yes. And we joined with the Latin American Studies Association, LASA, to file suit against that, and they dropped that whole thing. So it was probably the same time you were.
Yeah, that's really absurd.
It was absurd, and it was a real problem at that time. But anyway, you and I have been working on the popular art. I call it sometimes art naive. It's some of it is by painters or artists who are trained, and sometimes and mostly, I suppose, not trained from the ones you know. But you have gathered together at the center so many paintings, so many artists from over these years, especially I think since that end of the Soviet period and influence in Cuba. And we have a project that kind of follows up a little bit on my interest, which started in Brazil, but have expanded elsewhere. I'm interested in popular art, as I call it, everywhere. And everywhere I go, I look for artists like you described. And I usually just reaching out to lend them a hand, try to help them, just let them know that someone's interested in what they're doing for no other purpose. But they always seem to have a story to tell. And the Cuban artists have a story to tell.
Absolutely.
And so what we're trying to do is pull together, we have a collection of about 110 works of art that we put together. We're going to do a book on it. And
when I first went to Cuba, the only art I really knew about were the posters. And so that's what I started collecting. And now we have the largest collection of Cuban posters outside of Cuba, probably, of anybody. We have several thousand. We've got 10,000 works of art on site in our little gallery. 10,000.
Well, yes, I had 550 posters about which I gave to the university. I don't want people to forget it here either.
Yeah, I mean, it's very important. And I think that, yeah, what we've been talking about is the fact that these self-taught artists, are very connected to Cuba. And I have to say, I mean, although we collect art of all kinds, but personally, I'm most connected to the artist, to the art that still says Cuba. I mean, there are some artists who have become so internationally known, including some of my very best friends, that they started doing the kind of art that would be more interesting and more acceptable to metropolitan areas around the world, right? And also, it's the kind of art that we can't bring in. I mean, we can't bring in um, huge hanging things that spin around and come in 20 different pieces that we have to put together. They're the kind of installation art that has become so popular in the last 10, 15 years is something that we basically cannot bring in. Just the way we cannot bring in large sculptures. We can bring in small sculptures, we can bring in ceramics, but mostly we bring in paintings and drawings, works on paper, and small sculptures, as I said, ceramics, um, and posters. The several thousand posters we have, but the art is, they do every kind of art there, and it's wonderful. It's just that our particular interest is in showing something about the country at the same time. We
Well,
want it to be identified as Cuban. When people look at it, they say, oh, yeah, I can see that has to do with Afro-Cuban, it has to do with Santeria, or it has to do with the countryside, it has to do with the environment. They know that it's connected in some way to what's going on in Cuba currently, or in the recent past, or historically,
well, we about a year ago we had some discussions about the possibility of doing an issue of Latin American perspectives on culture.
That was the Canadian things
Oh,
that you sent me at one point.
from the Canadians, and we had
Mhm.
an interest in that woman who is now in Australia, who did 2 books on popular culture in Cuba. I've forgotten her name. She's a sociologist. You know her, I think. But we came to a general decision that we would do something on Cuba to show the world more about this uh, this art, this culture that you were so involved in, and but we don't have anybody to pull it together. And do you think it's still on our list as something we want to do? Do you think that it is still a worthy project for the journal?
I do personally. Um, and I would try and find somebody for you that I think would be good at pulling it together.
Other people may have comments and questions. We can have a dialogue here forever.
Anyway, we have enough late night conversations.
If you want to talk to Sandy, you call her at after 9 o'clock, 8 or 9 o'clock California time. That's when she's ready to talk. Have a conversation. I might go for an hour or 2 hours.
I'm one of those 3 a.m. to bed people. No questions?
Yeah, I have a question. It's not directly about art. I guess I'm curious, for those of us who felt some encouragement with the baby steps that the Obama administration took to sort of reversing the awful policies, and then it's been doubled down on, and Biden, of course, is a total loss. Do any of the Cuban artists who are in the United States or elsewhere, do they work together in any way to try to shape US policy or to try to get rid of some of these awful onerous restrictions?
None of the artists do. They're really too afraid. They figure their visas will be taken away. They won't get their green cards. They won't be invited back. I mean, the US government has all the power to allow them into the country or not. And I can't think of any artist who is active in any way. There are a number of Cuban exiles who are, but they are not artists here in any kind of temporary way. They are people that I can't think of any artists. There are some academics, there are a few, but I mean, people are just too afraid of what this government can do to them. I mean, that's why I say it's like the Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah.
I mean, they
Yeah, well, it's like Lhasa, you have to hold it outside of the country because you can't get visas for Cuban scholars to come. I mean,
it's outrageous. It's outrageous. And the thing is that Obama didn't do a very good job with Biden. That's all I've got to say. And Obama also, in his autobiography of his years in the White House, he doesn't mention Cuba once. He doesn't mention what he did to open relations with Cuba.
oh my God.
Not a sentence. Nada.
It's graceful.
And, Trump, 247 executive orders against Cuba. Biden reversed one, I'm sure, from pressure from the US airlines, because Trump said American commercial flights could only fly to Havana. You'd think he'd realize he's hurting the Cuban exiles because they're the ones who mostly go to Cuba, and their relatives don't all live in Havana. They wanted to fly to Holguin and Santiago and Cienfuegos and, all over. But so that was the only thing that Biden reversed. Now the flights can go anywhere that there's an airport to receive them. But that was it. That's the only thing Biden did. It's outrageous.
Yeah, pathetic.
It is pathetic. I mean, it's very, very, and Biden doesn't seem to understand that he's not going to win Florida anyway. Obama was a one-off. He won Florida, but Biden isn't going to win Florida unless he goes down there and says, gets some balls and says, look, I feel very bad for you. I know you're still crushed after 60 some years of not having your country be what it was before. But get over it. They're suffering. We've got to end this embargo. Let's have normal relations. You can go back and forth. The beaches will be open to you again, blah, blah, blah. I mean, he acts like it's still a question of Cuba's a dictatorship, and that's why the exile. He doesn't seem to get it, that it all has to do with money, 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 money. The people in Florida are crazed, thinking that if we open up things with Cuba, people might prefer the beaches of Cuba to the beaches of Miami. And they should. I don't know if you remember several years ago, maybe 10, 12 years ago, the head of the largest church organization in Canada, during one of the attacks on Cuba by this country, issued a call to all the Canadians that all of you Canadians who go to Florida beaches all the time, go to Cuba instead of Florida. And immediately the Canadians started going to Cuba in massive numbers. To this day, the Canadians are the ones who visit Cuba the most. They have their own hotel. They don't go anywhere except to the beach. They have their own hotels, all-inclusive hotels. And if they go somewhere that doesn't have an all-inclusive hotel, they make it into an all-inclusive hotel with Canadian shows at night and things that appeal to the Canadians in English. I mean, they have good food in Veradero at their Canadian hotel, but they don't even go into Havana, but I'm sure that is the biggest motivation. And, because the Cubans consider anyone who was born in Cuba to be a Cuban forever, that has allowed the Cubans in Florida to now go in and take advantage of the fact that the poor Cubans without any money and without any food are selling their homes and leaving to go somewhere else. So now the Florida Cubans are swooping into Havana and buying up all those places. Many of them are turning them into private hotels for any relatives they might still have. They're buying cars so that their relatives can drive taxis and they get the income. They have opened a huge Costco-like store where they sell items, Costco items, for more than you and I pay, which means who can afford it? Only those who have access to dollars. That means the diplomats and the Cubans who have family outside who send them regular dollar amounts. I mean, it's very corrupting and it's very sad. So that's the current situation that we're fighting. And we've got a president who is somehow afraid to deal with the Floridians directly. Very cowardly, really incredible.
Well, look at Gaza. I mean, no courage at all.
Oh, yes, of course. It's just another way of treating a country you don't agree with. Let's kill them.
Yeah.
Sandra, everything you say about Cuba, we can apply also to Venezuela. Venezuela is passing through the same situation, the same ordeals as a
That's
result of
right.
the sanctions.
That's right.
Affecting Venezuela equally. I want to ask you if you see, Cuba has faced an a particular economic crisis during the special period, and now again in the post-Obama years. And I was wondering whether you see a connection, a relationship between those periods of economic crisis and the criteria with regard to artistic expression that the Cuban government promotes.
You know, I can't see you.
Oh,
why can't I see you?
You can't see me. Why
No.
not?
You see arrows.
I see myself on the screen.
You
I
see
see myself too. But okay, now I see Tamar. Who was talking to me, Alex?
No,
Hey.
Steve Elner. Do you see?
Oh, now I see you. Now I see you.
Okay.
I was so concerned about trying to see you that I missed your question. I'm sorry. I was pushing everything to try and see you. Will you please repeat your question?
Sure. The relationship, if you see any, between the periods of economic crisis, the special period in the 1990s and the post-Obama period, whether there's a relationship between that and the types of criteria with regard to artistic expression that the Cuban government promotes.
Well, first of all, I think the government realizes it cannot promote any artistic expression. I think, if you talk about promoting some artistic expression, I would say it's probably limited to the ballet or but certainly not the visual arts. And in fact, many of the government organizations that existed in the 90s, for example, during the special period and before, I mean, starting like the government agencies that promoted all the political posters starting in the 60s and the 70s and continuing through the 90s. Many of those organizations, of course, don't exist any longer, even though they were government organizations, and they were basically propaganda organizations, right? And there's been so much turmoil in the cultural field in the earlier years, especially in the 80s and the 90s, with the first generation that graduated from the graduate art school, and there was an early attempt before an official Ministry of Culture existed by little autocrats who weren't really cultural people, who were running things under Armando Hart. Armando Hart was good, but the people who ran the music, the art school, etc., under him, were not Armando Hart. Let's put it that way. And so there was a lot of unrest around that and a lot of pushback. And I think that the pushback was basically successful. They said, you can't tell painters what to paint. You can't tell, I remember one of the few incidents where artists were actually arrested for a happening. There was a figure of Che that had been put in stone on a street, on a floor, right? And a number of artists came, and not with permanent paint, but with paint that could be washed off, right? Added to the figure of Che. And the cops came and said, "You are disfiguring our national hero. You cannot do that." And I mean, it was ridiculous. And they arrested them, and 2 days later they were let out of jail. But those kinds of little demonstrations were going on, but with such pushback that finally, it was really Fidel who realized that art was a great promoter of the Cuban Revolution, and it was great for the Cubans that the artists could do whatever they want, and basically said, hands off, right? And that's when the art world really flourished after that. There were good people in charge. The petty bureaucrats were basically thrown out. And I think that what's going on now is that there are so many problems that nobody is in charge, So individual artists are not having a problem in painting what they want to paint and presenting what they want to present. But on the other hand, they no longer have the kind of government support they had before because the money isn't there. And so I think on the one hand, the government feels it can't really order anybody to do anything because they're not paying for it much anymore. And also, Cuba is much more sensitive to international opinion than a lot of other countries. I know that it's just incredible to me that people here talk of Cuba as a terrorist state, as the kind of dictatorship. I don't know what they think it must be like. I don't know. What? Syria? They think they're Hamas? I don't know. They're certainly not Netanyahu. I think that I've never found anybody unwilling to criticize the Cuban government quite loudly and in my presence or anyone else's presence. I think the Cubans react mainly to anger. As long as whatever you are criticizing, you say in a decent voice and in a non-critical way, they're willing to discuss anything with you. That's been my feeling ever since I started going to Cuba. And it's one of the things I most appreciate about it. I think that it's very difficult after Obama opened relations. It was really wonderful for the Cubans. First of all, everybody from the United States started going to Cuba again, which was a tremendous help to the economy, and it wasn't dependent on Cuban exiles sending. Excuse me, I was in bed sick all last week with this horrible cold cough, so I sound pretty stuffed up, right? But I think that the whole cultural landscape is changing right now. If we're talking about culture, right? Not just social culture or political culture. But the cultural landscape, the Cubans have become so well known and so popular, whether they're the musicians, especially in the United States and Europe, theater throughout Latin America, the visual artists, especially in the United States, Canada, Italy, even Israel, that Cuba really belongs so much more to the world than a lot of other Caribbean and Latin countries, in part because of its love-hate relationship with the United States through all of its history. But also it's very complicated. They're very close to us in many ways. And they picked up some of our worst habits and some of our best habits. But they're super smart. I keep thinking they'll find a way out of it as long as they can just be given a little help, but without any help from this government, and just pushing against it, and always throwing it in with Venezuela and Nicaragua. And Cuba is not Venezuela, and Cuba is not Nicaragua. And I don't know what's the best way to get that through. But I think that if Latin American Perspectives can do a really good issue on culture in the broadest sense, it could have a real impact if it's done right. But we have to put blame where blame really is. And I don't know, it's, everybody is walking a tightrope, not really knowing how best to talk to people in the United States, because they're afraid of being interfered with in some way. We know that the United States government and the Cuban government are saying okay to some of these things. I mean, I was at a meeting of cultural workers at the Cuban mission not long ago. And one of the people who was there was Niederlander, who owns half the Broadway theaters, speaking very proudly of the fact that it's been acceptable to the Cuban government that he bring a Broadway show to Cuba. And I really felt like saying, well, what about bringing a Cuban show to Broadway? Another person stood up that night and said, we're bringing cable television to Cuba. Cable television that Cubans have to pay for? They get everything for free now? But they can't be doing these things without the agreement of the Cuban government. So, we at the center were sitting there and saying, what the hell? I mean, they don't need Broadway shows and cable television in Cuba. They need something much more. So,
Sandra, could you
the fact
comment?
that this large Costco-like store is there. I mean, we started a CCS food share program, and we have to buy the stuff in that Costco store. The 50-pound bags of rice that we give out for free to the disabled and the elderly and people who are living on Cuban pesos and don't have any dollars coming in. But we have to buy the 50-pound bags of rice and enough pork for a month and salads and blah, 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 the things that we buy there. We have to buy them at prices that are more expensive than if you go to Costco here.
Sandra,
Yes,
could you comment on Liz Doerr's book, please?
I haven't read it. Yep, I haven't read it. Ron told me quite a bit about it, but I haven't got a copy and I haven't read it. I hear that she was, according to Ron, she was very critical of the Cuban government, but I haven't read it. I should. I will.
Okay, thank you.
You have a question, Ron?
No,
Does Fran have a question?
I
well,
loved hearing what you had to say.
but you know, my view of this door, I expressed it in a very diplomatic way, I think, in that review, but it really would, I think it's a good question for you because you have been involved in interviewing Cuban families, Cubans and Cuban families, with the intention of publishing your own book along those lines, a book in which your interviews would reflect sentiments about good and bad and all the rest in Cuba. Maybe you could mention that because you sent me a chapter of it recently and I thought it was really, really good.
Did you read it?
I read it.
Oh, good.
It was long and I could see where you were headed and I just wish you could finish it off and get it published.
So do I, if I didn't have to keep working at the center 5 days a week.
Yeah.
Yes, well, my book is called Thicker Than Blood. Although they don't have that expression in Cuba, is the Cuban Revolution and Divided Families. And I've taken several nuclear families where parents and children or siblings have split in their ideas about the revolution. Those who left for the United States because they didn't like the revolution, and those who consciously stayed because they did. And I followed the same families for 25 years. But as Ron pointed out, I haven't been able to finish it because although I finished all the interviewing, I haven't had time to sit down and write it all. And so, yes, I do want to read Liz's book, and I'm sure we disagree about a lot of things. But I do think I know Cuba better than she did. She's smarter, but
One thing I would, as an academic, want to know, Liz said that there were, I don't know, 100 and something interviews, and she only used, was it 9 in her book? Ron?
that's what Ron said, and I was shocked at that. Why was that?
Yeah, so she does say somewhere that she's going to make all of them available. And I think it would be very interesting for some scholars to go through them and see if her selection was biased according to her own particular views.
I wasn't implying that I'm not sure the selection was biased. I think the selection was probably based on interviews that were more in-depth, more interesting, but I'm not sure. And the interviews were over 3 periods of time with the same people. The problem with the book is she didn't have a chance to really finish the book. I'm not sure she ever would have finished it. Sandy's struggling with her families and people that she's studied. And I think probably in both cases, you are reflecting Cuban sentiments that are both negative and positive. And I don't criticize what Liz included because of the negativism in the interview so much, because what you're seeing through the negativism is the depth of Cuban commitment and involvement in Cuban culture and life.
Yes.
It's there, you see. But it maybe was selected, but it's a very negative view. But I see in it the positive. And I don't think the reader will probably see it the way it's presented. And secondly, she only wrote 13 pages explaining what the project was all about. And it concluded with the sentence, "All is lost in Cuba. The best hope is, you might call it, a social democracy," or something like that. I mean, she was struggling in the last part of her life, and it was a long
Yeah.
project. And I just felt it was premature to publish it. But what can you do when someone passes away? And you have
I know.
colleagues around you who really, really were committed to her and wanted that book out. And
Well, that's why, the reason I chose Divided Families was very specifically because I wanted both sides of the family to feel completely free to say whatever they wanted. So choosing people who chose to stay because they liked the revolution and supported it, and their siblings or kids or parents who left because they hated it. I got, they were very open because they were both in their preferred contexts, right? Now, later, when some of the kids grew up and some of them who were still in Cuba chose to leave, then they had more shaded kinds of opinions, right? In a couple of cases, people who had chosen to leave chose to return. And then that was very interesting to find out why they chose to return and stay in Cuba. But the initial impulse of mine was to try and understand what was so strong about a revolution that it would break up a nuclear family, so that brothers and sisters, parents and children could feel so differently. Of course, now with Trump, we're all facing this. I can't go home for Thanksgiving any longer because I will not sit across from my Trumper niece and nephew. I just can't. I don't want to be there. I don't want to hear them blabber.
I think Liz saw herself as an heir to Oscar Lewis, but I'm not
Well, I
sure.
had a big fight with Oscar Lewis. He was one of the reasons I decided to do my book.
Well, but I'm not sure Liz understood Oscar Lewis's whole story, because it's very interesting. He didn't want anything to be published so he could punish Fidel for having confiscated some stuff and throwing him
Yeah.
out. But then his family and his colleagues decided to go ahead and publish after he died. And one of the, so Oscar Lewis was most celebrated or hated for his culture of poverty theory, which of course the Moynihan and other right wingers put to very horrible uses.
Exactly.
But Oscar Lewis said, the way I'll punish the Cubans for what they did to me was I won't tell the world what I found at Cuba, which was there was no culture of poverty. There was poverty, but no culture of poverty. And I wonder if you have any thought of what one would find today. Is there, I don't know if you're familiar with what he meant by culture of poverty, but
I am.
he thought you could be poor, but not hopeless and depressed and turning against your own people and becoming thugs and so on.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that's one of the things that has most impressed people who have gone to Cuba regularly, is that there is still, even now, for the first time, I can say I see a poor Cuba, which I never have seen before. But the culture of poverty does not exist. The Cubans have a shared way of dealing with the worst situations. And I think they have they have a basic optimism, a basic toughness. They've been through so much. I mean, if you're up against the United States and you've been fighting against the country you were closest to in a sense. And you've been fighting them for 60 years. On the other hand, they don't have Fidel, you know? And it's very interesting, you know, this, I think I told Ron this one night when we were talking. Luis El Estudiante Rodriguez, the one who is in charge of that little collective of artists outside of Santiago de Cuba. He is not in the least political, a wonderful painter. And he wrote me a long note about 3 months ago. And, you know, I asked him, what's it like in Maya? What's it like in Santiago? Because I hadn't been there all during the pandemic and I didn't know how they were doing. And so he was writing me and he told me about the difficulties they were having. No materials, food shortages, electricity shortages, the hurricane, whatever was going on. And then at the end, he said, I miss Fidel. It's like he hadn't said anything about the political culture or anything. But it was just that idea that somehow if Fidel were around, these problems wouldn't exist.
But
And I was really...
I am sorry.
That's okay. That's all I wanted to say.
Concerning the culture of poverty here in Mexico, whether in Mexicali or in Los Cabos where I've done field work, there are people who have not finished primary school, who work in the informal economy, and their children or grandchildren are attending universities. Is that something that would be happening in Cuba over the historical time?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, look, there are, I mean, you know, a country that's 99% literate, and that is so well informed about everything that goes on. And I mean, Cubans are really so smart and so well educated and so sharing with their knowledge that, you know, one of the things that always impresses people make jokes about, or they use it as a criticism of the Cuban government. They say the doctors are driving taxis, the professors don't have any money, everyone's got a second or third job. And all of that may be true, you know, but they still have the kind of joie de vivre and the sense that we're going to get through this. That, you know, I mean, I see so much depression here and so much anger, whether it's about racism or it's about Palestine or it's about traffic or it's about bicycles. I mean, everybody reacts to everything in a way to make it into a major case file. And that doesn't happen in Cuba. And I think, you know, a lot of it just has to do with their own tradition. They are an island culture. I remember when I first went to Cuba, I thought to myself, well, I'd never been to a real socialist country. Although I thought when I went to graduate school in England that I was going to a socialist country. That's Iowa for you. going from Mason City, Iowa to Manchester, England, and thinking you're going to socialism. And so when I was going over from Mexico City to Havana the first time, I thought to myself, well, I have to admit that I'll probably really admire what they're trying to do, but I wouldn't want to live there. Because the only ideas I really had to do with the Soviet Union.
Mm.
And that was it. I mean, I was very ignorant. And it only took about 3 weeks for me to decide I never wanted to leave Cuba. So I guess that's what Newsweek meant when they called Cuba socialism with salsa. But the Cubans are special. The Cubans are special. And I don't think they have that, maybe because they don't have a large native culture, but they don't seem to have that kind of depression that I've seen a lot in Mexico or in Colombia, or, it's a very different spirit. And I just hope they can keep it, it's a very complicated question now. And what's horrible is to realize that we are the ones who have the power to change that, and we've never done it. And people were so happy after Obama opened normal relations. But, if you think about it, Carter was the only one who lifted the travel ban. The only one. And the minute Reagan came into power, he reimposed the travel ban. Carter was the only one who visited Cuba before Obama. It's terrible to always have to be fighting your own government to try and help some other little government. It's a long battle.
Yeah,
The president of Mexico has tried to do something, and even he hasn't gotten very far. I'm sorry.
He's helped a lot for poor families, especially unwed mothers or single mothers, in terms of giving them pensions. And he's also expanded the healthcare system, but it's not Cuba.
No, and he's very supportive of Cuba.
Yes.
Even confrontational with Biden, which not many people are.
The president.
Yeah, Sandy, I wanted to ask you, do you see like distinct generational differences in the way people understand the conditions in Cuba? And are there things that you see that maybe given everything that they're confronting, that the Cuban government might be able to do better, or that would make people who are unhappy happier within the constraints that they're facing? I mean, are there things that they could be doing that you think they're not at this
Oh,
point?
definitely there are things they could be doing. I think that they have not dealt with the agricultural problems the way they should. There's absolutely no reason for them to have so much food insecurity now. Really, basically all of the organic farms and the kinds of farms that have been building up in, say, the last 10 years have all been basically private initiative. Working with the government, but it's their ideas to come and, can I get this plot of land, and what are the rules and regulations about it? And I want to turn it into an organic wonderland. And, young people from other countries have come to start, the government is supportive, but they're not pushing things. They're not trying to deal with that. Just the fact that they've let those damn Cubans from Florida come in and take over what is basically a private business and take money out of Cuba. Did you see that this woman was arrested in Miami a couple of weeks ago, bringing in from Cuba $100,000 in cash that they found in her luggage? She should have been bringing $100,000 from the United States into Cuba. No. And it turned out that she's been to Cuba like 150 times in the last 3 months, just bringing things in, getting money for it, bringing it out. Unbelievable. You can't let that happen. Neither the Cuban government nor the US government. She was arrested here because she was doing something illegal and they caught her. But the Cubans have to know that some woman from some Cuban exile from Cuba is coming from Florida 100 times in 3 months, that she's not there for good. So, there are things like that going on, that there seems to be no real control. And so, one of the things, I haven't been there since June now. I'm going down, as I said, the end of March. And one of the things I'm hoping to find out is just what is the extent of this, this kind of illegal/legal trafficking that's going on between Florida and Havana. Because I think it's hurting the people. In terms of whether it's hurting disproportionately the Black population, for example, I do not know. I do not think it is affecting racial differences. It is affecting poverty differences. It is people who do not have any access to dollars, who do not have a skill. They're not musicians. They're not artists. They're not, like I met two young singers when I was there in June. And in order to earn money, because their singing didn't bring in enough money, they were sewing clothes for children and for themselves. And I really liked their clothes. So I asked them, I bought all the children's clothes that they had, and they were doing it all by hand. And I asked them if they had sewing machines, which they didn't. And I said I would try to get them sewing machines. And we found two secondhand but very good Singer sewing machines in Havana, and we bought them for them. So now they have sewing machines, but Cuba's run out of its own fabric. So when I go down, I'm bringing them Cuban fabric, artist designed Cuban fabric, because there was a whole movement called Tel Arte, where famous artists from Puerto Carrero, Monte Bravo, all the well-known artists in Cienfuegos, Trinidad, and Havana designed fabrics. And I bought up every fabric I possibly could. So I'm going to take those fabrics back to Cuba so that they can make their clothes for our gift shop out of Cuban fabric. But, they had such spirit. They were having, we were sitting and talking, and they're sewing these little children's clothes all the time we were talking. And I commented on how pretty their pants were, how I liked it. They said, oh, we made them, this is just cheap fabric made in Cuba. But, I think now the main factory for cotton clothing is even closed. It's very difficult, very difficult. Anyway, I hope when I come back, I'll have more information that's answers better some of your questions.
Well, you'll have to put us on your list for when you get back. You have an
I will.
open
If Ron gives me, or Vera gives me, all your snail mail addresses and all your emails, I will keep in touch with all of you. In fact, you'll be annoyed that you get so many communications from me.
Vera can take care of that.
And then at the end, it always says donate. You don't have to, but we learned that we have to do that.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you about all during the COVID epidemic, all the medical shipments you were doing to get syringes and stuff. How did that work out?
It was great, right? The Cubans, well, if you follow the New York Times list of the countries that were fully vaccinated, Cuba was always up in, like number 3. I think United Arab Republic was always number 1. I don't know why, but it was. But Cuba was always up there. Somehow, they developed their own vaccines because they knew the United States would never share. We never share. And Cuba shared with everybody their vaccines. And 97% of the people were vaccinated. People in Cuba didn't say, I don't want a vaccine. You can't vaccinate me. And we still have up in our offices a photograph of one of the children of a good friend of mine there. And they gave every child a diploma when they were vaccinated. a vaccination diploma and some little doll or something, or a sucker, depending on their gender, I think. And proudly displaying her diploma and with her little mask, and I'm vaccinated. They made it into everybody got vaccinated, everybody.
And how effective
and
was the vaccine?
it was very effective, but what was terrible is that they had to wait before they developed their own vaccines, and some really good friends died. My friend Miguel, who ran the art gallery, he was an economist. He ran the art gallery in Cienfuegos and was the person I went to constantly. He suffered from diabetes, and his ex-wife was a doctor, and she begged the government to let them, when they came to vaccinate, they were only vaccinating healthcare workers then. A year ago, August, and 2 years ago, August. And the last communication I had from Miguel, he said, I've got COVID, I'm in the hospital, and he died. They said, we can't make exceptions. We've got to get only the healthcare workers. We don't have enough vaccines. And so he died. One of the best known actors died. The person who'd worked with Mendivi as his assistant and manager for 20 years died in Spain. He went to Spain for a big art fair and died in Spain. I mean, there were, really terrible, sad deaths, but once everyone was vaccinated, very, very low number of deaths. And even that was a low number. It's just, they happened to be people I knew. It was awful.
Yeah.
Whereas in this country, I only had one friend who died of COVID, and she was right at the very beginning before we had vaccines.
Did you have trouble getting permit or sending all the syringes and stuff to Cuba? Did the government try to stop you?
No, because Global Health Partners, on which I'm also on the board now, Global Health Partners had a license specifically to bring in medical equipment and medicines. And so that's why we did the collection with Global Health Partners. And it was great. I mean, we sent a Canadian group and the center, and the United States and Mexico. I think we were the three countries that contributed enough syringes for all, because they needed a syringe for every shot. And that's thousands and thousands and thousands of syringes, and we got them all there. We did. It was a great accomplishment, and I know that Bob Schwartz of Global Health Partners was super proud, and he deserved to be, because it was his initiative.
Yeah, no, it was wonderful.
Any other preguntas?
This has been marvelous.
You're too kind, Marjorie.
When you get to be my age, you think back over your life. And one of the thoughts I've had about Don's in my life is so much of it has been about Cuba. I mean,
yeah.
When we were in Chile, when Don came, he traveled around, and I came home with our children directly. And he went to Cuba right after. He was the only person on the airplane, passenger, that went to Cuba when in 1959, I guess it would have been. And then at Stanford, when we revealed, our journal there revealed the Bay of Pigs, it's all about Cuba. I mean, it isn't really, because it was about Mexico and Chile before, but the motivation that we got that, that there could be a place like Cuba.
I know. I was taking my doctoral exams at the time of the October crisis, and I'm saying, why am I even bothering? The whole world is going to blow up tomorrow. Remember that?
So what?
The October crisis of 62.
Oh,
Yeah, we were all at Stanford.
we left. Had we left? Yeah, we left. We came to Southern California.
Oh, you left before that.
Yeah, we. Don started teaching in 61. But and then so we did so much with Cuba later, going to Cuba and taking students and developing a class that was about Cuba. We called it Cuba and the World. It was all about Cuba. It was, I mean, that's inspired us to believe.
Yeah,
And
that it was
to
possible.
hear you, I feel like I can still believe. So thank you.
You're welcome. De nada, chica.
Sandy, thank you very much. I'm waiting for Christy to bring it to a close, but what do you think, Christy? Should we? We can go all day, and I'm sure you're exhausted by now. But you're just getting started for the evening, so I know you outlast us. But it's been very great and helpful.
Thanks for letting me participate.
Absolutely. Well, thank you.
Yeah,
Everything you do.
Yeah, this was amazing. I actually privately already chatted you my address.
Oh, good. Yes, I saw that.
Get on your list. But yeah, I guess we are at the end of the meeting.
By the way, if any of you are interested, I had to do something I hate because it was what do you call it when you're using slides and you have to give a talk with slides?
PowerPoint.
What?
PowerPoint.
Yes, I hate PowerPoints, but Meg Crahan begged me to do a PowerPoint talk for Columbia on Cuban art recently, and then she put it up on YouTube. So I really hated it, but if you would like to see it, you can see it because it's still up there.
under your name? Do we look under your name or what? Or
Yes,
Cuban
I
art?
think so. At Columbia University graduate, blah blah. Yes, it's there. If not, when I find it, I'll shoot it off to Ron so he can send it to everybody.
Oh, great.
Because I mean, it's nice because it's illustrated, but I very much cannot. I remember once the only other time I had to give a talk with PowerPoint, it was a talk at the Harvard Club on Cuban art, and I didn't even know what a PowerPoint was. And I had my cousin Jesse was there, who was handling the movement of the slides, supposedly in sync with what I was talking about. And Harry Belafonte was there. And after the talk, he came up to me and he said, "Get rid of those slides, will you?" And I said, "Harry, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to bring real art, but they said PowerPoint, PowerPoint." So anyway, I felt it was very incomplete, and I didn't get to show what I wanted to show when I was talking about it. But some people have said they liked it very much, so maybe you won't notice all the glitches.
We'll all know a lot more after we see it than we know now, so.
Thank you so much, Sandy, for your wonderful explanation. And
No, thanks for inviting me. Bye.
Say hello to Meg Craven for us. We remember.
I certainly will.
She got me my first teaching gig when I was in graduate school.
You're kidding.
And she asked me how much I was gonna be paid, and when she learned, she went to the administration and got me a raise.
Good for Meg. That's great.
Wow.
You know, I was with Meg at the first meeting of the Latin American Studies Association in 1966. And she was only one of two women in this founding organization of the Congress. All the rest of them were men, and North American men for the most part, not a single Latin American. And no
You're
one
kidding. Where was that meeting?
in New York, New York City.
Wow. I was in New York then. Why wasn't I there?
No, there were no women there. They weren't invited.
Oh,
Of course, I also wasn't a Latin Americanist. That might have been another reason. Okay, call me whenever.
No,
Well, it was
thank you.
wonderful.
Again,
Thank you so much.
Bye,
You.
Bye, Christy.
Bye, thank you, Sandra.
Thanks so much for all your wonderful work too that you do, your solidarity.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.